Hearthstone has a lot of expansions. Some are good, some are bad, some are questionable, but let's do a tier list for all of them. The way that I'm rating this tier list is based on how much enjoyment I got out of them, and make sure you do your own tier list. I'll leave a link in the description down below, and while you're down there, make sure you subscribe. A lot of you aren't, and I would appreciate it. For this tier list, I'm not including the basic set as well as the Demon Hunter Initiate set, because even though they're like kind of expansions, they're not really. So the basic set will be included in Classic, and the Demon Hunter Initiate set will be included in Ashes of Outlands. Starting off with Hearthstone Classic. So Hearthstone Classic was cool because when they first released the game, it was a complete game. So a lot of the meta was already kind of solved in itself, where there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of interesting stuff to try out. It was a really well-designed game. Now, some of the stuff was pretty broken. Like Miracle Rogue is still extremely good. Power overwhelming. Zero Mana Soulfire was gross. But overall, there was a lot of broken stuff in that expansion, or I guess in the classic set. So I'm kind of for putting it as an A, but I will be honest, I do think that Hearthstone Classic gets a little bit of a pass because it was the very first time Hearthstone came out, and I think a lot of us were just having fun regardless because it was a brand new game. The first expansion we had was Curse of NAXXRAMAS, and even though it was a really small adventure, it did have a really big impact on what the game was, with Nerubian Egg, Loatheb, Sludge Belcher. Most importantly, Undertaker Hunter was an extremely dominant deck, and I think honestly because of how dominant it was, it kind of ruined the expansion. A lot of people look back at Curse of NAXXRAMAS as like a really good moment in Hearthstone, but really was it? I don't remember it being like the best thing ever. It was really fun, and I think the solo adventure was one of the best aspects of it. The class challenges were great, but like overall, Curse of NAXXRAMAS doesn't really like hold a really high bar for me. I think Undertaker Hunter really made me not want to play it as much as possible, and I'm gonna put it at like a B. I do think it had a lot of really good qualities. It wasn't like the best adventure that we've ever had, and quite frankly, I think a lot of people overhype Curse of NAXXRAMAS. Next, we have Goblins versus Gnomes, and this set was really interesting because it had a really powerful neutral set. Dr. Boom, Piloted Shredder, Mech Warper. It basically enabled a lot of tempo decks, and some of the tempo decks were absolutely insane. There was a lot of poorly designed cards in this set. Implosion, Crackle, the Boom bots of Dr. Boom. I do remember the game being extremely hectic, and I think that's what made the game a little bit more fun. It was because it was just such a wacky experience at the time compared to what classic Hearthstone was. But I don't think the enjoyment was as good as classic Hearthstone. Probably about the same as Curse of NAXXRAMAS. Just a really ridiculous metagame. Next, we have Black Rock Mountain, and I'm gonna take a really big leap here and say this is one of the best times in Hearthstone, even though most people will remember this as the Patron Warrior days. And even though that deck was extremely good, there was still a lot of variety and a lot of really cool things to try out. Emperor Thorson, Dragon Priest, the whole idea of going through the Molten Core was just so fun, and it made you just really appreciate the flavor that they put into this adventure. This is an easy A tier for me. Next, we have the Grand Tournament, and I think overall the Grand Tournament was okay. Wasn't super great, wasn't super bad, but I think the keywords failing was a huge aspect of it. But there was a lot of Secret Paladin due to Mysterious Challenger. It also really brought Dragon Priest into fruition, which was really cool. Did have Justicar Trueheart, which I was an absolute huge fan of. So because of Justicar Trueheart alone, I'm gonna put this at a high C. One of the more weaker expansions we've seen in Hearthstone. Next, we have the League of Explorers, and I think overall the League of Explorers was actually a really well done expansion. It wasn't super broken, and it kind of came out of nowhere, which was really nice. And I really hope that Blizzard does that more often, where they just kind of drop random expansions, because it made the metagame a lot more interesting. Now, this is also the first time we saw Reno Jackson. Really fun idea for Highlander. At least Starseeker was cool. We got Sir Finley, which helped a lot of decks try different stuff. This was a really cool expansion. I think this is actually one of the more A-tier adventures for sure. Whispers of the Old Gods was arguably one of the best time in Hearthstone. Now, the reason why Whispers was so good is because this is the rotation of Standard and Wild, where they rotated Nax and GVG out of Standard, which opened the metagame so much more. Whispers of the Old Gods was a really well done expansion too. The Old Gods themselves were really powerful and really unique. It really brought the game into a complete different direction. There was something for everyone. The meta was so varied in what it could do. Control decks were there, aggro decks were there, not a lot of combo. Really well done expansion, and I honestly wish we can go back and try that expansion again for the first time because it was that good. S tier. Next, we have One Night in Karazhan, and honestly, when it comes to adventures, the flavor here was really well done, but the expansion itself was, it was definitely a really scary expansion. The problem with this is that there was a lot of really good cards that were super polarizing and a lot of cards that didn't do anything. Spirit Claws was a really good card. Barnes was an extremely frustrating card. We saw the rise of Discard Lock, Secret Mage, Secret Hunter, Unicorn Priest, am I right? I think generally speaking, like a lot of the cards were cool. This expansion was really, really powerful in the wrong ways, and I don't really remember being it super good. So I'm gonna give it like a C. Mean Streets of Gadgetzan is the next expansion, and this expansion was extremely powerful. The Cabal with all the Highlander stuff. We saw the rise of pirates with Patches the Pirates. We saw a really interesting archetype of Jade Golems, which, you know, probably wasn't for the best. And we saw Grimy Goons, which didn't really do anything because it was just ridiculously slow. This was a really ridiculous expansion, and Druid and Warrior really took charge of the whole metagame. You see what I did? Oh my god, this expansion was not super fun and it was super ridiculous. This is a C. Next, we have Journey to Ungoro. And just like Whispers of the Old Gods, the flavor in this expansion was legitimately one of the best ones. I thought the quest mechanic was really fun, even though a lot of them were extremely powerful. It didn't feel like it was unfun to play against unless it was Quest Rogue, which I know, Quest Rogue was ridiculous. Even the Quest Mage one was, but again, it just felt like a brand new game and the meta was just wide open. There was so much things you can do. Silence Priest was a deck, so that was kind of cool. I just remember this expansion being really fun. It's an S tier for me. Next, we have Knights of the Frozen Throne, and honestly, people really like this expansion, but I don't remember it being super fun because a lot of it felt like it was just covered by Shadow Reaper Anduin, and we also got Prince Keleseth in this expansion, so wasn't a super great time to be playing the game. Spreading Plague was also introduced, but I will give credit where credit is due. Adding the Lich King was really fun. Adding the new Death Knights was a really interesting mechanic because that was the first time we got hero cards. So there's definitely a lot of really cool stuff in this expansion, and I do think it was more fun than Mean Streets of Gadgetzan, so I will put it at B, even though there was some really powerful stuff. So next we have Kobolds and Catacombs, and I think Kobolds and Catacombs was just a really powerful expansion that was, I guess, testing the limits of what power creeping can do, because this expansion was just bonkers, right? Recruit was really good. They introduced the weapons with Kingsbane and Skull Minari. The cube was really cool. I like that thing. Spiteful Summoner sucked. There was just a lot of really powerful stuff that made the game feel just absolutely ridiculous for no reason whatsoever. And I don't remember this expansion being super great because of how ridiculous it was. And I think recruiting is a little bit questionable, especially if you don't do it in the right way. I do think that this was worse than Mean Streets of Gadgetzan though, at a C. Next, we have the Witchwood, and the Witchwood will be forever remembered as Baku and Gen, and that's virtually it. Sure, Shudderwalk was there, but that's not really what you were worried about in this expansion. I think this is one of the worst expansions we've ever seen. I actually did a whole video on it that I recommend you watch. I'll leave it in the description down below. But the main reason was just because Baku and Gen really set the stage of what the year was going to be like. The expansion itself was rather weak. It didn't really have a lot of really redeeming qualities. I do think Monster Hunt was pretty fun. I remember playing that a lot, but Standard absolutely sucked. This is the first D of the whole tier list. Next, we have the Boomsday Project, and the Boomsday Project was an interesting one. There was a lot of really powerful stuff in this expansion. Dr. Boom, Mad Genius, Ziliax, Mech Hunter was a huge aspect of it. We did get Mechathune, which did introduce a lot of interesting combo decks in the format. We also got the Puzzle Labs, which I think is one of the most fun additions to Hearthstone ever. But generally speaking, the Boomsday Project actually managed to have an impact after what the Witchwood brought to us with Gen and Baku, even though there was still a bunch of odd decks in the format. I do think that the Boomsday Project was like kind of in the middle of the pack. It had something for everything. I don't think it was necessarily broken. I don't think it was necessarily weak. I thought it was just a pretty good expansion overall. Next, we have RASTAKHAN'S Rumble, and honestly, RASTAKHAN'S Rumble is just so forgettable. Overkill was just, what a mistake of a mechanic that was. A lot of the stuff in this expansion was just really bad, didn't make an impact whatsoever, and it basically just took the best cards of this set and just kind of put them into the already good decks that we already had. I will say Akar and Shrivala are two of my favorite legendaries of all time, but the set was just too weak to see any play. The flavor was really good, but unfortunately for RASTAKHAN'S, it's a D. Next, we have Rise of Shadows, and Rise of Shadows was a really cool expansion flavor-wise and introduced this year-long thing between the League of Evil and the League of Explorers, which I thought was really cool. But the biggest issue with this expansion was that it introduced lackeys. I hated that mechanic. I legitimately thought that mechanic was one of the worst ones we've ever seen. it just led to a lot of really ridiculous games because they were super impactful. And then the metagame was like, the first half was all aggro rogue with evil miscreant at 5 health, and then we got control warrior for the rest of the expansion. Not super great. I actually think it's one of the worst expansions I've ever played. Next, we have Savers of Uldum, which introduced us back into Highlander cards. We saw Zephyrus, we saw a bunch of quests again, which were really fun. And honestly, this was a really good expansion in terms of what it brought to the game. A lot of variety, different ways of playing the game. There was Combo Priest, which was like an aggro deck that was pretty fun to play against, but it had a lot of moments where it would just win the game. But once that deck was kind of nerfed, we saw the metagame kind of open up quite a bit. And I think even though there was a lot of rough moments in Savers of Uldum, it ended up being a really fun expansion at the end, and I really enjoyed it. I actually think it's one of the A tier expansions. Also, the cinematic is beautiful. Next, we have Descent of Dragons, and I think a lot of people forget how powerful this expansion was. It introduced us to Galakrond, and Galakrond Shaman was really good for a couple weeks there. It introduced us to Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, which was just ridiculously powerful. Remember when it could discover itself? That was something. There was Necram Apothecary Rogue, which was extremely ridiculous to play against, and it felt horrible to lose to. Generally speaking, this expansion was just insanely powerful, but there was a lot of really fun stuff to do. And I think even though the decks were just extreme and there was so much chaos, this expansion was fun. It reminded me a lot of Knights of the Frozen Throne, just a completely wacky expansion where there was just a lot of stuff to do. So it's going in the B tier. Next, we have Ashes of Outlands. And quite honestly, this expansion was just Demon Hunter, or you're playing in Rage Warrior for a majority of it. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, considering that, well, Demon Hunter was a brand new class and it added a lot new qualities to the game. But if you did not like Demon Hunter, you were probably not playing Hearthstone at the time. So it's an extremely polarizing expansion, especially because, well, Demon Hunter was really good for a lot of it. So because of how strong Demon Hunter was, and because there wasn't a lot of variety to this expansion, it's probably like a high C, I would say. They added a new class. What can I say? So SCHOLOMANCE Academy is our next expansion. And this expansion, in my opinion, is the strongest expansion we've ever received. There was so many good quality cards. Almost every single class had a unique archetype to try. And I felt like even though the game was so extreme, this is when Hearthstone was almost at its most fun in a very long time. Just so much ridiculous stuff to do. It felt like every single type of archetype had a chance. Maybe not as much attrition anymore. It was kind of wacky. Guardian Animals dominated, but because of the new development team, they were nerfing extremely quickly. So there was just a lot of different stuff to try. And I don't know, there's something special about SCHOLOMANCE Academy. Maybe it's the flavor, maybe it's the Spellburst keyword, which I really thought was a well-designed keyword. I hope they bring that one back, by the way. I really like Spellburst. Really powerful. And don't get me wrong, I think there was a lot of stupid stuff in it, but the stupid stuff really just, you know, match the other stupid stuff. And I think if everything is just stupid, nothing's stupid, right? So I'm gonna give SCHOLOMANCE Academy an A, maybe a B. Actually, a B sounds better. Our next expansion is Darkmoon Faire, and honestly, Darkmoon Faire was just not really an expansion because all it really did was just add to existing archetypes. It did bring back the old gods, which I think was really fun, but because the powerhouse that was like Demon Hunter and basically the really good decks from SCHOLOMANCE Academy stayed around, they didn't really get a huge chance to shine. It felt like this expansion was just kind of padding existing decks, almost like RASTAKHAN'S Rumble. The corrupt mechanic I think was kind of cool. Theme was fine. It added some interesting stuff like Silas Darkmoon, but overall it wasn't super impactful, and I felt like it just kind of was there. So probably around a C. I don't know. I think like I could maybe put it as a B, but I think it's around a C. I think it's around here. Forge of the Barons is our next expansion. This introduced us to the Frenzy keyword. We saw the mercenaries for the first time, and generally speaking, this expansion was a lot more wide open than Darkmoon Faire was. It felt like there was a lot of different stuff to try, but it ended up being a really weird metagame because Control Priest, which generated card after card after card, was the top dog for an extremely long period of time, which a lot of people did not like. And I think the idea was that they wanted to go away a little bit from like what SCHOLOMANCE Academy was, but it wasn't a super enjoyable expansion at the end, even though you could try a bunch of stuff. With the limited card pool and basically what the game was doing at the time, I think a lot of people stopped playing near the end of Forge of the Barons. Yeah, I don't think Forge of the Barons was a super well done expansion, but it was definitely not the worst. I think it was probably like a C. It was basically like Demon Hunter, but like the reverse of it. United Tournament is our next expansion, and this introduced us to the questline mechanic, and it basically introduced us into a metagame where it felt like you had to kill someone or you were just gonna die. There was no no room for slow type decks, and this was a metagame that was purely based on combo decks. If you like combo decks, then this was probably a really good expansion for you. But my overall enjoyment was at probably the lowest it's ever been, because I did not want to play Hearthstone at all during this time. And I think a lot of the casual people can probably agree with me that this expansion felt like there wasn't a lot of room to do anything you really wanted to. This is probably a D for me. This actually is probably worse than the Witchwood for me, honestly. Fractured in Alterac Valley is the last expansion on this list. And honestly, Fractured in Alterac Valley was a lot better than I expected it to be, because while United STORMWIND was just ridiculous, this tried its absolute hardest to probably, bring control decks back into the game, and I think it succeeded. The metagame at the moment is really well done, and there's a lot of variety in this expansion. A lot of powerful and fun stuff to do. A lot of creativity can be done. This was a really good expansion. It was also the ending of the Mercenaries campaign or storyline, and I honestly think that they did a really good job. This is probably an A tier for me. That's my tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you disagree with me, that's completely fine. Let me know yours with a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. You look fantastic.